not seeing all your bright and shining faces, but we're really delighted to welcome you. We will be starting in just a moment. I think we still have a few people trickling in. Let me make sure I'm good. So you're in the right place if this is what you're looking for. I just want to make a comment about the previous webinar about the role of healthcare professionals in schools related to child protection. That is up on the ECIS website. It's on the ICMEC website under What's New Regional Safeguarding Events, and your regions should have a link somewhere on their homepage. If they don't, please feel free to reach out to us, and you'll find our email at the bottom. You'll also find it on the Ed portal, and we'll make sure that you have access to that webinar. This webinar will also be posted, and we will be providing the slides as a PDF, because our main goal here is that you will take these conversations that we're having now together back to your home schools and organizations, and you will continue to have these conversations with colleagues. So this is really a training the trainer. We are hoping, and I will be pointing out places where you can access resources for those purposes as we go along. We also really intend for this to be very participatory, and what we hope is that you will find your chat in a minute. You can find it now and say good morning if you would like, and be comfortable in this space with us. And this is very interactive, so you won't be able to multitask this morning in this hour and a half that we're together. So this is a 90-minute webinar. You will be using breakout rooms. We will be having conversation. Just a quick brief on ICMEC, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and how we came to be in the international space. That was largely due to a partnership with the Office of Overseas Schools with the U.S. Department of State, and they have supported not just this webinar, but a lot of professional learning around child protection. And I just want to thank Cam Chauhan, who is also on the call. You'll see her face there. She is the interim CEO of ECIS, and we are really happy for that partnership. You're also here because we have partnerships with all of your regions, with the regional education associations in your regions. ICMEC itself is always collaborating across sectors, because that is what we do. We have law enforcement trainers, physicians, healthcare professional trainers, social work trainers. We work in the financial area in order to stop sexual abuse and exploitation of children. In the education sector, we cover all forms of abuse. And I do want to point out that you will see, perhaps in some of your breakout rooms, a few of the regional trainers. This is a brand new pilot program. We have regional trainers in the regions listed on the slide here. I can see one, Debbie Downs is here with us. I think Ian Russell from the Middle East, Perry Awad, also from the Middle East. I think we might have Astrid Amador and Tanya Duran Balen. Also here, we may even have some from Africa, Funke and Chanel. So they come from very broad experience. We have social workers, clinical psychologists, HR professionals in our regional trainers, so that we have that deep subject matter expertise that we find to be really critical in these conversations around child protection. Of course, if you haven't already been on the education portal, you'll get a chance at the very end to see some of our resources, but you can also find it at edportal.icmec.org. And you'll see that we have resources in fact, a quarter of our resources are in additional languages, but we do have a shadow portal in Spanish that is growing and growing. These are the stated objectives that we put out to you. We'll be covering all of these areas. This is challenging content. These are the hard conversations, and we hope to give you some ballast for going back to your schools and your colleagues to have these conversations. But we are willing to consider that English may not be the first language of everyone on this call. And so where we can, we are going to have breakout rooms by region that might include accommodating another language such as Spanish or Arabic. but I am going to give you a little more detail on that in just a second. So if you would right now, reach out to us in the chat and say hello, say where you are in the world right now, because that might not be your region. And I'm going to pull up my chat just so I can see the good mornings going by. My goal here is to show you that we will be using several tools this morning. If you're not familiar with QR codes, you just take your mobile phone and put on camera, center the QR code, and then just click on the link. We'll be using that with a Padlet this morning. We will be using some polling. You'll know we have a poll coming when we have the question mark there, and we'll be using the chat quite a bit. So take this to learn the web, take this moment to learn the platform that you're looking at right now. See where you can find the chat. If you haven't found it, you can always reach out in a private message to one of the people you see on the screen right here, but Joe Whitson would be my suggestion. And if you're having any technical difficulties, Joe would be the one to reach out to. And good morning. I'm seeing the names go by, and that's amazing. So happy to have such a great Monday morning group from my time, and good afternoon and good evening for those of you who are finding it later in the day. So as you're finding your way around Zoom, I think many of us already know this platform, but some may not. I would invite you to open the participant window. You'll see the icon with the people at the bottom. If you click on it, you'll see a list of names. Find your name. You can find your name by scrolling down or by putting your name in. I'm not sure if you might just only see your name. If you hover over your name, you'll see an option of mute or more. And if you click on more, you'll be given an option to, I'm not being given that option, but I hope you are. You'll be given an option to change your name, rename yourself. And what we'd like you to do is rename yourself to include your region. So I'm going to put in US, but you might be Latin America, European, in Europe, or Middle East, North Africa, Africa, Asia. So put your name after that and your language preference. And this will streamline the making of our regional groups that we do. And you can see, I see some of the names changing. Awesome. Thank you so much. And then celebrate because you're done. We will try to incorporate regional breakouts a little bit later this morning. When we talk about child protection, and we hope that you do the same when you talk to your staff, we always take a moment just to center ourselves and to remind ourselves that in any group of people, we have among us survivors and supporters of survivors. This is important to note because sometimes these conversations can raise strong feelings. And certainly when we have a conversation around ethical dilemmas, we can certainly feel looking back on something that we may have made the wrong choice. We are very focused on looking forward. We can't operate on what we don't know. So it's important for us to learn more, but also to be a little bit kind to ourselves, to step away if we're feeling strong emotions, and to know that that's perfectly natural. I also want to mention that this is a chance for you to sort of unpack some of the bias that you might have around topics related to child protection. It could be that you supported a survivor and you know you feel strongly about certain aspects of abuse. That's also a bias to unpack. Not knowing is a bias, but also sometimes knowing intimately the content can be a bias as well. And so we would invite you to take this time to really try to broaden your thinking around the topic. And the last thing is really our sharing agreement. Because we will be sharing stories in the breakouts, we just encourage you to anonymize where you can. We say teacher 1, teacher 2, student A, student B, something like that. If you forget, don't worry, that's natural. And know that the people in your group will not share your story without your explicit permission to do so. I think it's important for us to remember that our stories are our own. Of course, all of the cases that you'll be seeing this morning are real cases. Those you can share, the slides you can share, but when someone shares a story of a dilemma, we'd ask you to keep that private unless you've asked the person. So We also always start with rights-based child protection with a conversation about what we believe and definitions. So if you would, go ahead and open up your chat if you haven't already found it. Now's a great time to try and bring that up. And please put put a fact in the chat. Any one thing or two things about child protection that you feel like is a statement about what you believe. So let's see what kinds of things we're getting here. And I invite all of the regional trainers to do the same and the organizers as well. And let's see what we can all agree on related to child protection. Has everyone found the chat? It's necessary. Okay, that it's a priority. Responsibility of all community members. Love that. Absolutely. Okay. Valid. I hope you're reading this. Valid information. It's everyone's responsibility. Right? There's a problem if children don't feel safe, they can't learn. Everyone has a role to play. There's some comments here about training and some comments about risk. I also love, thank you, Tanya, for mentioning student agency and voice as well. And feel free to, if you've been thinking about that, feel free to keep putting those comments into the chat. They will enrich our discussion. So essentially, when we think about child protection, it's really important to talk about what the parameters of a child protection concern are. They aren't just that a child has been harmed. They would include that a child was at risk of harm. And they would also include this idea around, and I think sometimes this can be hard if you're just beginning this process, to think about your duty of care as reaching beyond the school gates, that it's not just all students enrolled in the school, but those impacted by the operations of the school. Because in many of your schools and in your capital cities, in your locations, when a school employs someone who works at the school, they are identifying that person as a trusted person. As soon as a school says, this is our math teacher, then for parents and children, we are telling the community this is a safe, trusted adult because they work in our school. This is someone we have employed. So really what things that happen outside of the school, of course, are going to impact the learning environment in the school. And so those are a part of your concern as well. I think everyone in the room will already be comfortable with some of these ideas around what is abuse, physical, emotional, or psychological abuse. We're really focusing on those two, plus sexual abuse and neglect for schools, but of course, extremism, child marriage, child labor, all of these also are forms of abuse. And this is really where we want to make sure that all of our colleagues are on the same page. Abuse can be committed by both adults and children. As we saw in the chat, all adults are responsible. You may have a designated safeguarding lead and deputy, but they aren't the only people responsible for this. And I think this last one is also really important. Abuse is not rare. It can be prevented. And children cannot consent to abuse. We don't typically use the word consent when we talk about a child who is involved in an unhealthy relationship with an adult or another a peer. So we might call them a compliant victim, but we do not say that they consented to abuse. And there's a lot of reasons around that related to their ability to process long-term harm and evaluate relationships from that lens. Finally, I just want to point you to a lot of literature that's already out there around professional ethics. The top one is Etico, which is a UNESCO website. You will find there a map of the world, and you can click on your country and see what your country says about teachers' codes of conduct, teacher ethics. I've also cited here the US version. We have on the portal, you'll see the long version of professional ethics as well as a short one pager. And those are things you can look at, as well as international and national laws on the portal. And as I said, we'll put that sort of at the end. I'm just noticing there's some messaging in the chat. I will expect that if there is a question there, please feel free to ask it and stop me at any point. And one of my colleagues will let me know that a question is there. So what do we mean by an ethical dilemma? really just, it's a hard decision, right? A decision-making problem. You may not have thought of it as an ethical dilemma. You may have thought of it as a conflict, but this is where we get into sort of what some people call the gray area or the tough stuff. And this complexity is arising because one obligation is in conflict with another obligation. And I invite all of you right now, as I go through a couple of examples of these, to think about one that may have happened to you. And so think for a minute in your teaching career, in your role in a school, whether it's as a counselor or a nurse or a leader or HR professional, think about the conflict between truth versus loyalty. Just take a moment to think about a time when you weren't sure whether you should be loyal to someone or cover for them, or you were being pulled to be honest and tell the truth about something. Another conflict we would see typically is sort of right now what works, but what's better for a child in the long term, or what's better for a colleague in the long term. Certainly conflicts around the needs of an individual versus the needs of a community, and we'll see that a lot in child protection. And finally, which we also see in child protection, are issues around justice versus mercy. And of course, what comes to mind might be different from what comes to mind for me, but I think when we think about peer-on-peer abuse, very often this is a conflict that we are addressing. So thank you for taking a moment to think about these things. Now I'm going to ask you to share some of the something versus something conflicts that you have had. So if you open up your chat box, put in, so one of the examples I just gave was a peer-on-peer case where it was the needs of a student who harmed and versus the needs of other students. So that would be one possible conflict. So let's see, by using chat, what kinds of conflicts you were thinking of as I was going through those examples. Great. So even within a family, what one child needs and what another child needs, certainly in our family, that has definitely been the case. And when I was teaching, we had twins, identical twins in different classrooms. And very often we were, with my teaching colleagues, we're talking about the needs of one sibling over another. Any others that are coming to mind that are conflicts, whether they're child protection conflicts or other kinds of conflicts? Awesome. So someone has mentioned here your duty of care to a victim, but if the person who is harmed is an adult, we owe them due process as well. We certainly have a legal obligation as well as an ethical obligation to the person who's been accused. Plus, we might not have all the information yet. If a student will ask to leave the school, very often victims or survivors leave the school because of their own choice, because of the damage that's been done to the climate around them, or side taking has happened. Reputation of the school versus individual rights. Great. Love these, seeing these come through. Okay. So some of the ones that I often hear are, the board versus the leadership, or the staff versus the parents. Are you going to be loyal to the teacher who says it's one thing, or the parent who says it's another? Certainly for healthcare professionals, there could be a conflict between Western or scientific medical approaches versus traditional medical approaches. These are conflicts we sometimes feel, and certainly the best interest of the family would be something we would need to balance with the best interest of the child, because of course the child resides in a family, and so what is the best interest of the child might be what's in the best interest of the family. Great. And I still see some coming in. That's fantastic. So really, essentially, what we're talking about here is the hard stuff, right? The legal dilemmas, professional dilemmas, and ethical dilemmas. I'm going to ask Katya to start the poll. Let's see what you're thinking a little bit beyond the chat. Katya, if you launch, oh, I can launch the poll, actually, it looks like. So I have a couple questions here, and you should see it pop up on your screen. In my professional training, I learned about ethics, true, false. And go ahead and answer both of them. I think there's three, actually. Yes, there are three. In my school, we address ethical and legal conflicts in policy or cover them in training. And I have faced an ethical dilemma or uncertain decision related to child protection. So I'll give you a chance to get some of those answers in. And hopefully everyone's finding it. I think I might be getting close. You can keep doing it. I'm just going to end the polling in a few seconds. So go ahead and finish up. Scroll down and finish your questions, and I'm going to end it in 5 seconds. Okay. So I'm going to share the results with you now. So you can see that most people felt that they did learn about ethics in their professional training, which is fantastic. In school, we addressed possible ethical or legal conflicts. So 60% of you said you absolutely do. About a third say no, not really. 9% are not sure. I want to say here that what this research tells us is that teachers do not ask ethical questions of colleagues, and they don't do that because they feel that it makes them look unethical. So they feel like if they're not sure what the answer is, that must mean that they don't have, or at least it would give the appearance that they don't have a good sense of what's right and what's wrong. And so I think it's really important to understand that we're starting with a base of reluctance to talk about these kinds of hard decisions. And so that I hope will give us even more interest in having these conversations. And then we've seen about half of you have had ethical dilemmas or uncertain decisions related to child protection. Okay, great. Okay. So we can close that if that's on your window, but I should have pulled it down for you. So let's look at, let's actually just get started. We're going to do, Katya's going to put us all in random breakout rooms. So what I'd like you to do in the breakout is first introduce yourself, say where you are in the world. These should be, Katya, I think these are groups of 5 or 4.
Okay, I'm just having a hard time finding the breakout rooms here. It's not showing to me as an option.
Okay, let me just see if I have them.
It's weird because I'm host, but I
Yeah.
only have the support.
Okay. Let's see. I am not seeing breakout rooms right now. Can you, if you make me the host, perhaps we can pause the
Try.
recording. So we will come back to this once we determine, and I will let this person in. Let's go ahead and go to the Padlet. Let's go ahead and go to the Padlet. So you should see on your screen a QR code. There's also a link there that I will be happy to put into the chat for you so that you can follow the link to a Padlet. And what I'd like to do is just get some thoughts onto this resource about how we might resolve an ethical dilemma. So I'm going to escape out of this for a second and put the link in the chat. And let me also say that those of you who grabbed it as a QR, you can go there now, and I will put it back up in just a second. Okay. All right. So link for all, everyone. All right, so the Padlet link is up, and I will put the screen share back up for those of you who want to take it as a QR code. And then we will also go there together in the screen share in just a minute. So here's the QR code. Go ahead and navigate to that Padlet, and we will join you there. And let's get a conversation going about how you resolve an ethical dilemma. So I'm going to stop this share and go into the Padlet. Okay. And okay. So I think some of you are here. No, I don't have any comments just yet. So let's see. Are we having some difficulty making our way to the Padlet? Let's share the screen with the Padlet. Okay, so yeah, so I'm beginning to see some comments coming on the Padlet. How do you resolve? We're seeing putting big assumptions on the table. Fantastic, that keys in beautifully with what we're talking about. Your beliefs, what your pivot points are, what your priorities are. I'm seeing doing case studies and learning. That's absolutely true. Looking at all sides of the issue with trusted colleagues and leaders. I can hopefully some of you are finding your way to this Padlet. You'll also see the link at the top of the page that I've shared. So if you haven't followed the link in the chat, you can also see it there. Different lenses, awesome. And again, multidisciplinary approach, collaboration with multiple people. And that is sort of where we're heading in our conversation about having different perspectives on things. And I'm really glad to see a number of you include others in your decision making, which is really critical. We know from case reviews that when you work alone, sometimes we can see a lot of errors proceed from that. Policies, having policies out there so that you know what you're, having an anchor for your decision making rooted in national laws and policies. Fantastic. Being honest about the dilemma, love that. I'm interested in this assumptions. I would assume that here, assuming the kids make up stories of abuse, is sort of addressing bias, addressing myths around abuse. I think that's really important. For example, myths like abuse is rare, myths like false allegations are common, which in fact is not true. Although recanting and denial of abuse is common. So having that knowledge behind your decision making should make it better. And I would invite you to continue to contribute to this Padlet here. I think all of these are great ideas for us to take forward. I'm especially digging this one here. Communicate policy to all stakeholders every year. Yes, absolutely. But I think too, our idea of who stakeholders are needs to be broader than it's been. So I think of an example of a school in Asia that had a disastrous case situation happen. And what they found is rather than distrusting local authorities, the more they reached out to local authorities and made it known that the school prioritized children's safety, enabled them to move beyond this disastrous response because the school was actually actively making clear where they were rooting their decision making in. And so that actually built a lot of trust with the local authorities. So I'm seeing these be added. And again, you can keep going with this. I'm going to pull out of this shared screen. But please, I invite you to continue to add to that Padlet your ideas, and let's go back and do a case together. Going to have to, all right, just for a second. And you are still adding to this, fantastic. Okay, so here we go. So lots of great ideas. And let's do this case together. We'll use the chat for this one, and hopefully we'll be able to go into breakout rooms in just a minute, but we will use the chat for this case. So this is a case where a boy has disclosed physical abuse to the nurse. The assault was perpetrated by a relative, and the child has asked for a medical exam. So they wanted to see a doctor. But when mother is informed that child has gone to the nurse's room, she overrules this, strongly overrules this. I would invite first the nurses, if we've got any nurses in the group, to go into the chat first and say what you think should happen here, what obligations you feel for you as a healthcare professional are in conflict. So where is the conflict for those with and let's loop it, let's take it a little broader. If you supervise healthcare professional in your school, so if you're a healthcare professional or a supervisor of one, what are the obligations you see as being in conflict here? And I invite you to go to the chat and give us your thoughts. And I'm just letting Joe know that I turned off the record, so I'm not sure, Joe, if you've turned it back on.
And now it's paused, but we have done the, we have.
Okay. And are we going to be able to do breakout rooms?
Not yet.
We're still trying to find a way, Laurie.
No worries, no worries. Okay, so I would invite now anyone, all educators, counselors, all participants in the webinar to go ahead and give us what you think the obligations are that are in conflict here. So I think we certainly have an obligation to the student, who is also the patient for healthcare professionals, who has made a request for medical attention. But certainly as a school, we would feel some obligation to parents. They are the carer of the child. And so that might be part of the conflict as well. There might be an additional conflict where someone in a leadership position wants to yield to the parent, and the healthcare professional says, no, this is my patient and my patient is requesting medical attention, and so that should go forward. We might also see that other people are involved. Perhaps there would be a counselor involved in this situation. So if we think about how we would proceed, I'd be happy to go to the chat and get some ideas about how you would proceed when a parent says the child is telling a lie, and you believe the victim might be pressured to recant this disclosure of abuse. So what are the possible ways forward here? And I've certainly mentioned that counselors would be involved at this point, and I think it would be entirely appropriate for them to be involved. And what we would like to see, I think, is that there's someone working with the parent, but it's very clear that the school has a duty of care here, that a student that is in their care has requested medical attention. In this case, we had really a disclosure that had a lot of sensory detail. So it didn't at all seem to the nurse that this was a false allegation in any way. And in fact, I think the next step might be to invite the parent to come with, to include them in the decision making, and to support the student in their right to make this request. So there's no, all of the cases I'm going to put up for you in the next 45 minutes or whatever we have left will be challenging cases. There is no sort of list of things that you should be doing, and you can just go through the list and you'll automatically be covered. But I think this is a case where we see a lot of times that we tend to yield to parents, and perhaps too quickly. So certainly the nurse will have made some kind of record of the injury that she has observed. You will have that in your central record. The school hopefully has a policy that lists what you're going to do in cases of physical abuse. And so that would be an important foundation to lean back on. And you are, as a school, probably going to stress that you want to uphold children's rights, their right to choice, their right to give an opinion, and make a request like this for their own health. So let's go on to the next one. Oops, sorry. This one still also a challenging decision to be made. Your response team has already met about this case. They have recommended a course of action to the final decision maker in a case that was involving a student who had extorted with other students the sharing of sexual images. The boy who was identified as the one who started this was from an important family. And when the parents were notified that there had been 3 or 4 disclosures, they threatened to sue the school if he was expelled. The board would very much like to handle this quietly. And during the amount of time that this decision is going forward, one of the victims has recanted the allegation. So what conflicts are you seeing? And again, I invite you to use the chat. What conflicts do you see here in this case?
Lori, before we go to this one, there is a great comment that the counselor, principal, and director will be involved, and the child will be examined first and then speak separately with both sides. So it is really interesting to think about, can you actually evaluate, examine the child without the parent's permission? And that's a legal implication, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think many of these cases circle back to not just what the law says, but what is commonly prosecuted in your country. And so this case as well, if peer-on-peer abuse is never prosecuted by prosecutors, not that you would want to criminalize the child, but there could be aggravating elements. For example, the level of the threats, the likelihood they would be carried out, the level of the trauma of the victims, how widespread it was, how many victims there were, other aggravating elements on the case. The school would really need to be pretty familiar with their local authority, not just the Family and Child Services local authority, but also law enforcement and what was expected of them walking a case out. So Tanya, thanks for that. I'm not seeing the chat anymore. So I do invite you to let me know when we have some comments that we want to share on there.
Laura, do you want us to read the responses they gave for your case now?
Let's move to this one, Katya. So any
to this one, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so there are 2. They said policy and actions. Sorry, board versus school leadership. Policy and actions in conflict with fear and of reputation and revenue loss. Image, reputation versus team response recommendation. Recant is normal, and duty to the victims in taking issue forward and opening it up can put the staff member in conflict with the school leaders.
Yeah, thank
you.
Those
are the comments.
And I actually see, I think that there's an additional conflict here that is to the students who haven't disclosed yet. Bystander students and other students who may have been victimized who are watching and waiting. So we're always aware when we discuss a child protection case that there are some silent people who have information who are waiting to see what plays out before they give that information. And if we think about proceeding where this was shut down, another of the disclosing children decides to recant, pressure is put on the victims to recant their allegations or deny that this happened. What you end up with is a climate that is more hospitable to abuse than it was before, because now you have empowerment of perpetrators and harm, and you have a silencing of victims. And we know that cuts across. It may not be a peer-on-peer case. It could be an employee sexual misconduct case that's also happening in the school. That victim would then be much less likely to come forward and disclose. So a lot of damage can be done, and some thought needs to go into not just what our initial conflicts are, but also what are the student conflicts? What are the long-term outcomes this decision might have on our school climate? So it's not just this one litigious parent, it is all your students that their welfare that is in the balance here. Great. Hopefully we're going to give you a chance to look at some cases, but if you don't, we'll continue to press on and I'll show a couple more where are we on regional breakout rooms or random breakout rooms?
Laurie, I don't think it's going to be possible. I
Okay.
think Zoom's had a slight meltdown this afternoon.
No worries
I
at all.
apologise.
By the way, I just want to mention that you will all get these slides and you can have these conversations with colleagues. We will send them to you make them available as a PDF. But if you want them as slides, please just reach out to us and we're happy to make that happen. So in fact, I will let you go to the cases, however, because you can use this QR code to go ahead and go to the cases, and I'll ask one of the panel people to follow that link and then put that in the chat so that you
I
can
do
have it.
that.
Awesome, thank you. So let's go to, this is
No,
quite a way.
go back, sorry.
Sorry,
Just go
that's
back
okay.
again.
Sure.
Good, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So you will find in that Google Doc or in the Google Slides that you have 4 cases here. We're not going to run through them all. I will probably only do one of them so that we have time to have a little more discussion on other topics as well. But here we go. Principal off duty. Is the principal off duty? Let's see. This is actually a UK case. So some of you in the UK may know what the outcome was here. A principal who was exemplary has a close friend who is a known, so it was in the newspaper, and convicted child sex offender. During the period of time in the trial, this person was seen with her at home, around the community. This person is a very close friend. It's not clear whether there was a romantic relationship, but they are intimates. And this person was at her home frequently and stayed there for some period of time as well. This person has never been to the school. When this was brought to the attention of the board and senior leaders, she defended her actions and said, this is irrelevant and it has nothing to do with my life at school. So what obligations are in conflict? Are there conflicts? Let's hear what you have to say in the chat. Or actually, I just invite you, we don't have that big of a group. I invite you to unmute and go ahead and let us know your thoughts.
Hello, Laurie.
Hi.
The first thing that I think here is that she's a role model, she's a leader of a community. How can you possibly say that a certain rule does not apply to you? Are you saying that it's just wrong on so many levels to me? So does she never talk about this with her friend? How can you be friends with somebody that's done something that is so wrong? And how, as the community leader, can you be seen in public with that person?
Yeah, so certainly she herself perhaps feels some conflict, but she's resolved that by saying, you know, I'm loyal to my friend. It has nothing to do with my school life. And so it's on my own time. I have exemplary performance appraisals. So for her, she's resolved that ethical dilemma by yielding to her friend. As the response team, you have a very different set of conflicts. And I think, Cam, what you're saying is that you're seeing a conflict between when you hire someone for this position, you're looking for a certain ethical standard, but you're also employing someone that you're going to identify as a trusted adult. I will say that a child protection role was listed in her job description, which is actually quite rare and should be more common. So she was also asked when she was interviewed whether there was any reason that she knew of that she could be biased or have a challenge in areas related to child protection. And she said no. And the court case was going on at that time. So she did not disclose that she knew someone who was an accused child sex offender.
And one of the posts in the chat says there is a big conflict. How can the principal be objective when cases of abuse are reported if she's choosing to continue to be friends with someone who has harmed children.
Right, right. And I think it's, I don't know if it was in the chat as well, but you know, this hits all of us close to home because we want to think we have a professional life and a personal life and that they don't bleed into one another. And I think this is a great conversation to have. And one of our positions is if something can be Googled and students and parents find out, it does impact the learning environment. So if there is something out there about you in the social media, that is going to impact our learning environment. So that's one thing we could stand on. The other is the school luckily had put something in her job description about her role as a role model and as a upholder of child protection in the school. This went a little further actually because she continued to resist the school's involvement in this case. She said that it should be a firm hard line, and she was dismissed. And it did go to the courts, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the country. And her dismissal was upheld because of her resistance to consider that this in any way endangered a child. Her resistance to consider that the board had a right to safety plan around her laptop, whether this person would come to the school, if they came to the school, what would the safety planning be around this person who was obviously in jail at some point but would get out. And so it was actually precisely her response to this that they felt proved that she wasn't capable of fulfilling her position. So I think it's really interesting and important. We see this in a lot of cases that the action, the response of the person who's accused or the person involved in the case really plays a big part in this decision making around what are we going to prioritize here? Are we going to prioritize her right to have a personal life? Are we going to prioritize the safety of our students or the reputation of the school in some cases? Okay, I'm going to show you one more. This was a challenging one. This was an international school case that came to us. This was a child who had been demonstrating harmful sexual behaviors against other students. There had been a number of meetings. It was escalating and becoming more aggravated. So there was upskirting, there was actual contact. So it started with verbal and then there was contact, sexual harm. And when asked by the counselor, the child said they couldn't help it. So there was an element of compulsion. The student was separated into a classroom by themselves with a teacher and an aide. And as the school tried to sort this out, the family was very firm about ruling out counseling, which in any event wasn't readily available in the country, specialized counseling. And there wasn't really an interest in pursuing treatment for this compulsion. And the parents are planning to transfer the child to another school. So if you would just put in the chat what you think are your obligations, what things are in conflict, and how you would proceed.
So somebody has typed in obligation to future school.
Other obligations?
Also, we've got short-term versus long-term. There's a conflict of privacy of the child versus protection of the future school children.
Yeah. And also the child's right to access to education, which the school felt they were upholding by putting them in a separate room, but isolation is really something that would be harmful. It was perhaps okay while they were making a decision over a day or two, but as a long-term solution, it's really not a solution. This is a challenging case. In many countries, it would be very difficult to share your child protection record with an onward school. You would really need to be aware of what your data protection obligations are. You would need to have established your central record. Everything would need to be documented so that it was very clear there was progression, why you'd made the decisions you'd made. And certainly bringing the family in to the decision making would be a really good first step to try and get them on your side, because what we really know is that when an intervention occurs in harmful sexual behavior that's appropriate and there's accountability to the child, the recidivism rate, so the likelihood of reoffending later on in childhood or even in adulthood, is very low. So really, in this case, the school doing the right thing for this child is not only preventing harm within their community, but onward harm outside of their community and on into adulthood. So a lot of heavy obligations in this case.
Lori? Just one question here that seems to be very interesting, and if you don't mind me just speaking a couple of things, is that whether parents' refusal to help their children could be, this child in particular, could be considered neglect. Just one little comment before I hand it to you. Neglect is one of the hardest forms of abuse to prove, legally speaking. But if you have it in your policy, depending on how you're phrasing it, yes, the school can definitely take the stance. Again, it's part of take the stance on pushing your decision or something like that. But legally, it is very, very hard to prove. So just a little comment. And if you have anything else to add, Lori?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really all about real talk here. And I think what ends up happening is that school counselors end up having to step in and provide some kind of counseling to students who are acting out in harmful ways. It is possible this child was a victim of abuse as well. So really information gathering would need to happen there as well, which the parents might also be pushing back against. So really, anytime we have peer-on-peer abuse, there are going to be a lot of ethical issues surrounding them. And I think it's really important to be very clear as you can be in your policies and your statements on your website about what your position is vis-a-vis harm and abuse of violence to children. And those will give you a standing place to say, look, well, when you chose to come to this school, we made very clear that we will act on all forms of abuse. And so this is what it looks like, whether it be positive parenting classes or gathering information around things that you might suspect to be intrafamilial abuse. But you don't know that this might not have been a teacher involved with this student prior to that. But whatever the case, this is a vulnerable child. So the child who harmed is probably the single most vulnerable child in this entire child protection concern, depending on what actions they took if there was a sexual assault. In this case, it was touching, molestation, but not to minimize that. But I think you have to look at all parties, especially when you have a peer-on-peer case and you have two children at the center of a case. Great. Thank you so much for your comments. And there's a couple more, which I'm going to flip past, but they're very interesting for you to work on with your staff, and you will get them. So I think just to sum up where we are, we're looking at lots of conflicts within the institution, right? Child to child, child to staff, parent to staff. And we also, though, have these conflicts with external providers, whether it be other schools, local authorities. Are there any others that you can think about where you might have conflicts outside the organization? And would you put that into the chat as you have them, as you come up with them? So other possible conflicts. All right.
Partner organization is one.
That was what I was thinking.
Other parents who know about the incident and how it was handled, financial backers, outside coaches and tutors, other people treating the child.
Yeah, one that's commonly not thought of is your insurance organization. So whoever is insuring you, what are their expectations around background checks, reference checks? What are, sorry, Katja, is there more?
Oh, sorry, it was just
Okay. So really being aware, not just of national laws, but how are you indemnified? What are what are the expectations of your insurance? Your accrediting agencies, inspection agencies, recruiters, all of these would be things that you would want to think about with regard to child protection concerns. So I think we have a poll that we can launch. In fact, I think I can launch it. So I'm feeling very empowered to launch a poll. I'm going to launch it now. So I'd just like to get I finally got the chat. It just popped up on my screen. So I'm very excited that I can now see what you are all saying. Do you feel that discussion about ethical dilemmas is important? And why don't these conversations happen or happen more often in our school? Let's see. So 100% so far. Let's see what you are thinking. Those answers are coming in. I'll give you another few seconds. Oh, no. I'm going to give you longer than a few seconds. I'd love to get as many people as possible answering this. Right now, about half of you have answered the poll, and it's climbing. Just a couple more. Okay. So here's, good, a couple more coming in. Leaving the poll open for a few more seconds. Go ahead and vote. Okay. So this is what your thoughts are. 100% said, of course, that it's important. And the main reasons it doesn't happen is it can be culturally challenging, and that about half of you said there's not enough time to have this kind of discussions. And I would submit to you that maybe some of the options here are around breaking it out, not just into the whole whole staff training or whole faculty training, but to approach it as more micro learning, micro professional development. So it's 5 minutes at the end of a staff meeting. Maybe everyone has chosen an article from the portal to read, or you give them a case ahead of time. In the next meeting, there's just a short conversation about some of the dilemmas that are in a case, for example. So those are kind of options that you might have. Thank you. I'm so excited to have the chat back. So I wanted to, and we'll continue to use the chat. I'm sorry the breakout rooms didn't work this morning, but let's continue to use the chat, and I can see it now. What must you overcome to have these conversations? The first one, of course, is as Ian has said, if it's not on your radar, you have to overcome that. Other things, someone mentioned cultural. So what things related to culture do you have to overcome? Great. Fear, judgment, some biases around conversations around abuse, some of the myths that are around abuse, such as if we talk about it, it might look like it's happening at our school, and therefore that would be a bad thing. We hear that a lot from every culture. Not having enough information, so not being sure, that sense of uncertainty that people have. They don't, we certainly, all of the regional trainers who are on, and I certainly know people are afraid in this case to give the wrong answer because they're afraid it might make them look like someone who would harm a child or who would ignore the harm of a child. So great. Thank you for these comments that you have here. I think there are huge challenges around perception, around the relationships that we have, even within a school. We're all working in schools, and I'm an international school teacher. Well, we're well aware that there is sometimes you aren't going to go to the nurse or consider her an equal colleague, and that needs to change. Certainly, a bias between how counselors are perceived in working with children by faculty members, and I say that as a former faculty member, that we need to have more discussions across disciplines and roles in a school. So including HR professionals and people who do the hiring, for example. So we're not going to go to breakout rooms, but I would invite you, if you're working with your team, to talk quite deeply once you've looked at some cases about what kinds of things you can put in place that will lead to more ethical response, and find out what their views and feelings are. Certainly, what we've all been alluding to in the chat is that there needs to be a process, right? There needs to be policies and procedures. And part of that is understanding not just what our school protocol is, but from cases where we go wrong, where the mistakes are. Certainly, I read a lot of cases, and anyone who's on a child protection team should timing, sort of, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens. And we see from that case example I gave you, which was when they waited to see what would happen, the children who had made the allegation started to recant. So in that case, time became really more harmful to the decision-making process, because once you have children recanting, then you get a division of the student's opinion, you get a division of belief, and that ball will continue to roll downhill. So in addition to having a known and trusted process, part of that is knowing what our biases are, what our interests are, making sure that our telegraphing out to the world, to other schools in our network, in our locality, this is where our values are, and we will share information about students when they transfer from one school to another. Now, we won't send it in a letter with the parent. We may make a phone call to you and speak privately, or we may let our counselors talk to each other. We may share some elements of our child protection record with Onward schools. And so but trust obviously needs to be built in order to do that. And certainly the variety of opinions and viewpoints a lot of people have said. Finally, I would say, as a part of having the knowledge you need to have to make the right decisions, is also consulting experts. And I will give you some resources about consulting experts in just a minute. I also think that having a framework for how we make our decisions is a great way to start. There may be Christian school representatives here who are saying, we're going to take a religion-based framework, right? We're going to take an ethical-based framework. Most schools have a duty of care. It's ingrained in statutory guidance and legal laws related to school education provision. So I've chosen a duty-based framework here. Our other frameworks could be professional, could be moral, could be legal. From the basis of a duty-based framework in your school, really the top driver should be what benefits the child, right? What will best preserve a child's rights, their autonomy, and actions that do not harm. And so sometimes in child protection, in fact, very often, and my colleagues will back me up on this, sometimes there's no perfect solution, but you can choose a course of action that causes less harm. And we also need to use those lenses that someone has said: immediate harm versus short-term harm versus long-term harm. So thinking through all the different areas. You are an organization in a country where there are laws related to child protection, and certainly those should be included in your policies and procedures. And a part of your duty is justice and fairness. And I've already mentioned that you have not only a duty of care, but a right to due process for adults who have been accused of harming a child or a criminal offense. Gathering information, making sure that you've addressed the biases that come with, these are your teachers, right? You know them, you respect them, you hired them because you thought they were going to be amazing, and now they're being accused of something terrible. And so understanding that you are going to have to find a way to park your bias. If you were the person who hired that person, you will be much more likely to make a better decision if you have multiple people looking at this and you recognize and call out issues of bias and ignorance right at the start. And finally, just that your organization, your institution, is focused on transparency of process, as well as confidentiality of detail. So those are two things that you need to think very explicitly about. And what I would submit to you is that, yes, obeying the law does uphold your reputation, but also putting the child at the center is also going to uphold your reputation. So if you're seen to be responding in a legalistic way, that can hurt your reputation. So it really needs to be balanced across different responses so that, and I should say, not with protecting our reputation as the first consideration, although senior leaders and boards do have a responsibility to the school to uphold the school's reputation. So, we're not going to hide from that. We are just going to understand that the best way to support that is to put children first and to follow the law. I think this is an area that can be forgotten very often. And I put this slide in here because I just want to remind you that there's a shared understanding about all these things. And my question is to think for a minute about who needs to know. Who are we having a shared understanding with about rights of children, about the school's role in preventing abuse? So if you would pull up in the chat, I'm hoping it'll pop back up magically again, and tell me who you think needs to know about, for example, what your reporting and response process is, what kinds of training your employees and partners will be expected to get. And again, I'm not seeing it. So Katja, if you don't mind letting me know what kinds of things are
Sure.
coming in.
They said board, parents, teachers. You can also press, Lori, Alt tab, and I think you will access the chat again. Try that, just in case.
Yes, thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you. Okay, students.
By the way, when you're trying to move the slides, you need to click back on the slides and Alt tab again to access the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I'm hearing a lot of internal stakeholders, and that's awesome. We do expect that the board would have a representative who has deep learning around child protection. That would be model practice. What about external stakeholders who might need to know some of this information? Great. So I'm seeing partner organizations. Certainly, if you're doing service learning projects and you have an organization that you work with, or you have someone from outside the school who runs your activities, after school activities, or provides coaches for your soccer teams and your football teams and your volleyball teams, those are individuals. For sure. Thank you so much, Debbie, for mentioning lawyers. Very often schools, attorneys, or legal counsel are really on the side of employment, which means you're going to get a bias there to employment law. You need to be sure that you have some legal counsel that is up to date on child protection law or human rights law. And I love that I'm seeing local authorities here. Really critical that law enforcement, that Child Protective Services knows that you are interested in the thresholds. You want to know what should be reported and what shouldn't be reported. You want to know how you can support victims and how you're going to walk it forward as well is important information for them to have. Great. And certainly all employees. We hear anecdotes sometimes, and this is actually an ethical dilemma that someone told me about, that a beloved cafeteria worker who all of the students adored had taken pictures of students and had pictures of them on his phone. And when a parent found out about it, she came to the school and said, you have to fire him. And they did fire him. And my question to them was he trained? Did he know that he shouldn't have pictures of students on his phone? And they said no, they had never talked about the obligations that you have when you work with children. And so really that's on the school, because the school could easily have fired there someone who was a trusted adult for students in their school, someone who was going to make children safer. And we hear very often cases where cafeteria workers are the school staff who notice or who children disclose to. So that's really critical. Awesome. So I think that research supports this, that the whole community approach is the way to go. And I do want you to think about what kinds of steps you can take next, what your plans are when you get off this webinar, what are the sort of task items that are on your list or things you can delegate to someone else in your school. Here are some of our ideas about things that you can delegate or look at. One is identifying a board member and making sure that the senior leadership team is aware of some basics around child protection, having a response team in place. You'll see that we've put here MDT, which stands for multidisciplinary team. That's about building trust and reaching out to those partners in the community who will support cases, whether they be child psychologists that you refer kids to, or knowing a hospital emergency room where a child could be taken for a sexual assault examination, a forensic examination. That's information that you need to have that you can start gathering. And here under laws, when I say age of, what we're talking about here is you really being aware of what the age of consent and the age of criminal responsibility are, so that you can proceed in a way that's appropriate for your location, as well as, of course, due process and other issues. I do want to mention again, someone said it in the chat, and I'm really, if there's one thing you do, it's ensuring that your students have voice and agency, and there are many ways to do that. Talking about their rights, child protection, prevention education should be based on asking children what's needed, where the dangers are, safety planning, and these sorts of things. But I would caution you, before you talk to students, you really should have trained your staff, have your policy in place, and have your reporting protocols in place and functioning, because what can happen is if you start talking to students about this topic, they disclose, and if it's not handled well, it can be silencing instead of empowering. So there's a number of resources that are out there to support you. We've already given previously the Ed Portal short link, as well as the page that we have just for COVID for educators. And here is a QR code that you can follow to go to the education portal right now. I will point out to you that on the portal under policies and procedures, not only do you have sample policies from all different parts of the world, as well as template policies, but national laws are there for about 70 countries. Just note that the date of update is on that resource, and double check that it's recent if there have been recent changes in policies, national laws. I should also point out that there are a number of audits for different areas and checklists. If you've already started down this road, and I know some of the participants in this webinar have excellent programs and they're working on refining them, the audits and checklists is a great place for you to look for, say, auditing, for example, prevention education for students, looking more closely at environmental audits, how you walk your campus, what are you looking for, and how are you implementing safety planning for students. Finally, if you aren't already aware of the allegation protocol, that's what we call it. It's managing allegations of abuse by educators and other adults. You will find that under reporting and support incident response. It's also at the top of the landing page on the education portal. There's a QR code here for it. It's around 40 pages. Half of it is prerequisites. So when a case happens, that first 15, 20 pages should already be in place. And that will maximize good decision-making around child protection. I'm going to open this up to questions in just a minute, but I want to give you a chance to see what another resource that's out there, thanks to the support of the the Office of Overseas Schools, who are supporting the International Center Response Team. So I'm just going to play this, and then we'll go to a question and answer.
Every school, everywhere is different, with different resources, different cultures, and different challenges. But protecting children from harm is our duty of care. The International Center Response Team gives schools the critical support they need to better protect every child, everywhere. Schools can apply for advice on a child protection concern using our safe online encrypted form. Those applications are reviewed within 48 hours. Accepted cases then receive consultation from the response team child protection experts. The best part? This service is completely free for eligible schools. To learn more, visit icmec.org.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to just put up my access for emails if you would like to reach out to us, and give you our social media links.